So hello, everyone. My name is Catherine DeVita. I'm the training coordinator with the Alliance. And today's session is cybersecurity within the controlled access management for research data. So welcome to today's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm working from Montreal, situated on the unceded traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. As we proceed with our webinar session today, it is with acknowledgement of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis nations, and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research, and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. I'd also like to quickly go over the code of conduct. So the Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form, and harassment can be understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Victoria Smith, our presenter for today's session. Victoria is a data governance and data ethics specialist with a background in sensitive research data management, research policy, and research ethics. At the Alliance, she is leading work to advance the management of controlled access to research data to develop research data governance frameworks. She contributes expertise to a broad variety of initiatives within RDM and ARC, using her academic background in ethics and her professional experience in research policy and data governance. So welcome, Victoria.
Thank you.
And finally, a quick overview of today's session before we begin. So the session will provide a brief overview of the Controlled Access Management for Research Data initiative. So you are all here to learn about the CAM initiative, its 29 partner organizations, the FRDR Sensitive Data Pilot Project, and some of the cybersecurity considerations associated with this project and research data held in research data repositories. So without further ado, Victoria, I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So again, my name is Victoria Smith, here to talk to you a little bit today about the CAM initiative and some of the cybersecurity considerations within the initiative, and then perhaps a bit more broadly with regard to RDM as well. So for context, researchers are increasingly required or expected to deposit data for review and or reuse. So gone are the days when research data would sort of languish on a flash drive somewhere. More and more researchers are expected to find an appropriate repository to steward their data in the short, medium, and long term. And of course, medium and long term is what we're often most interested in with regard to research data repositories. And this is all well and good if you can easily share your data and you have a variety of repositories available to you to choose from. But depending on the discipline you're working within, some of the considerations for your data set, and certainly if your data are sensitive, your options may be more limited. So not all research data can be published openly. Of course, some require controlled access. So, that broadly speaking, data that contains sensitivities, perhaps confidential, proprietary, or embargoed information, that's not exhaustive, just some of the things we think about with regard to sensitive data, but there's a broad variety of reasons that data may be sensitive, or there may be restrictions or limitation on publication, sharing, or reuse. So the Controlled Access Management Initiative, our goal is to support researchers, repositories, institutions, and organizations with managing controlled access to research data. So that means things like enhancing data security while enabling data discovery and facilitating appropriate data access. So we often think about balancing sort of discoverability and accessibility against security and privacy. So the more security and privacy we have, the more difficult it is to discover or access data. And I'm going to suggest that this is a bit of a false way of looking at the situation. Now, we don't need to think of it as a zero-sum situation in quite that way, that rather we can enhance security or we can enable good security practices while still promoting data discoverability and ultimately secure, controlled, managed access. So there are three key components to controlled access management. The first is technological. Do we have the means to secure data, to control it, to manage it in the ways that we want to? So here we're thinking about infrastructure. We're also thinking about software, sort of the technical capacity or the technical infrastructures and systems we have in place conceived broadly with regard to data storage, data management. But then there are workflows that relate to how we manage data. So here we can think about institutional workflows like ethics review or privacy impact assessments, or other channels of review and approval that determine where data can go, who has responsibility for those data, who may access them later on, what sort of possibilities for data reuse may exist, and so on. And then even beyond that, we need to think about resourcing and particularly training and education. So you may have the coolest technology in the world that does all the things you want it to do. And if you're really lucky, you've got institutional workflows and processes that enable you to use those technologies. But if you don't know about them and can't use them confidently, can't navigate those systems, both the workflow systems and the technical systems with confidence and make decisions within those systems, you're still going to struggle to maximize your capacity to manage your data effectively. So to speak a little bit about that technical piece with regard to the CAM initiative and what we're doing with technology within the initiative. So one aspect here is that we have the FRDR sensitive data pilot project that I'll be speaking a little bit about. FRDR has developed a zero-knowledge encryption software application that it's testing now in the context of this pilot. And the idea here is that this technology is platform agnostic, so it can be used with other repositories or other data stewarding environments. So it's highly adaptable and highly versatile. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. What we're also doing, though, beyond the FRDR pilot, is taking up examination of different technologies and data services and infrastructures more broadly. So we're not just looking at FRDR or the FRDR pilot, but more generally looking at various options in Canada that exist, scalable solutions, service gaps, and otherwise examining the environment for technologies and services that support controlled access management for research data in research data repositories. So a little bit now about that zero-knowledge encryption application I just mentioned. So this is at a very high level, a diagram sort of showing you what zero-knowledge encryption means, which you may already be very familiar with, but in case you aren't, what we're talking about is encrypting data in a local environment. So we're not moving the data to encrypt it or anything like that. Wherever it's stored right now, wherever you're housing it, you can download a local application there to encrypt the data. But what's key here, what we're trying to show you with this diagram, is that it's only the encrypted package that's then deposited in FRDR. So FRDR never interacts with the original data set or the unencrypted version of the data set. We never have eyes into that as a service provider. We only ever interact with the encrypted package that the researcher deposits within the repository. And by zero-knowledge encryption, we mean that we, as the owners or the stewards of the encrypted package, not owners, stewards, have no access to the key. So when a researcher or a user encrypts a data set and it generates an encryption key, that key is stored elsewhere. And this sort of mirrors a pretty standard best practice. So you see this in research ethics, and it's an easy way for me to explain it to folks coming more from the research ethics side of the house. A best practice there is that you never store your study data alongside your study key. So your study key would say things like, these are the individual participant names and contact information, and then here are the identifiers we've generated to use in the data set to de-identify it. So you might have Victoria Smith as participant 1 and Catherine DeVita as participant 2, and that study key must be kept separate from the data because certainly if someone were to gain access to the data, we wouldn't want them to also have access to the study key, and vice versa. If they somehow gain access to the study key, at least the data are housed elsewhere. It's not a completely foolproof system. Certainly, a bad actor could try to get their hands on both, but storing them separately means at least that needs to be done twice to 2 different storage locations. And so it's an important best practice. And so similarly here at FRDR, we don't interact with the encryption keys at all. So just to give a sort of high-level summary then, so what do we mean by zero-knowledge encryption? It's a cryptographic method that allows one party to prove that they have knowledge of information without revealing the information itself. So we're talking about verification without exposure, which is essential for privacy. And so what's important here about this model is that when we talk about data discoverability, making it clear that FRDR has data assets that are available through a secure access process. It's not just like a catalog listing that says these data exist somewhere in the world. It says we have these data. It's just that they're encrypted. And so we are talking about publishing a data set while storing that data set, stewarding that data set. There's a fundamental link there in terms of the landing page, the metadata describing the data, and actual possession and management of the data set itself, even though it's encrypted. So how it works should be pretty obvious. So there's a prover, in this case, FRDR, that says we have access to these data. They're encrypted. They're with us. They're stored, with other data assets. And the verifier who receives confirmation, but no actual sensitive data are disclosed. So they can verify that we have the data set, and there's means that they can take to access that data set, and they can interact with all those workflows without actually seeing or interacting with the sensitive data themselves. So why is this particularly relevant to research data? It enables data discovery without compromising access control. So when we talk about the fairness of data, the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of data, that first point, findability, it's critical that folks can find the data they need. It's not enough to say those data exist somewhere, but to be able to discover them through a search portal such as Lunaris, for them to be indexed, for the metadata to be harvestable, for it to become apparent to the research canon that there is a record of those data and where those data are stored and how they can be accessed. So we're enabling that discovery process by publishing metadata that's linked to the data set without actually compromising access to the data. So here are some key benefits then to using a zero-knowledge encryption model with research data. So as I just mentioned, discoverability is critical, so exposing metadata. But granting access based on predefined rules. So what we can do in a model like this is make it clear how someone can go about getting access to data, what they need to do in order to request access and ultimately have that request be granted, and have that accompany the metadata record and the data set itself. So we're not simply doing what's often done right now in research where folks say, well, data are available upon request, but it's not entirely clear what that means, or even sometimes how to go about making that request. And then, of course, compliance and ethics. So there's all kinds of privacy laws or other regulations and policies that may be relevant to how you manage your data. And zero-knowledge encryption is one way that you can meet some of those obligations and to support best practices around open and closed data. So we often hear the phrase, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And zero-knowledge encryption is one way of promoting that best practice and enacting it. So some applications in a research context, as I mentioned, metadata searching. So enabling folks to discover metadata records linked to data sets without actually viewing any of the sensitive content, but certainly being able to access READMEs, data dictionaries, or other content that can make it clearer for the researcher to determine, or easier for the researcher to determine whether or not those data are worthwhile or could be beneficial to research that they're considering undertaking. Controlled data management. So access is given only when approved or under specific agreements. So being able to enact that management aspect of controlled access, having processes and mechanisms in place that oversee and allow for auditing, adjudication of access requests, and ultimately granting them. And then last, collaboration. So there's lots of solutions, there's lots of ways to approach secure access and managing secure access. Systems that rely on internal infrastructures may be less compatible with external collaboration. So zero-knowledge encryption is just one way of sort of getting around some of the limitations that sometimes exist when you're working sort of strictly within institutional confines. There's lots of pros to that approach, but some of the cons can mean that sort of folks coming externally have a harder time interacting with those systems. So certainly if you're thinking about interinstitutional collaborations of various sorts, zero-knowledge encryption, the model that we're working at with the FRDR team, is a neat way of enabling collaboration with multiple users or researchers collaborating across regions. So the FRDR sensitive data pilot project that we're working on right now, that's currently underway and that is using this technology, Has a number of sort of components here. One, of course, is to test this application. It's gone through lots of testing with the team, sort of internal testing with dummy data sets. But now what we're doing is testing it with real data sets. So researchers who are navigating the full workflow, including the use of this particular piece of software. Also then, of course, testing our repository deposit workflows. So we have existing systems in place that enable the ingest and publication of data. And now we're testing those workflows using the encrypted packages generated by the application, again, with real researchers working with real research data sets. And then lastly, the access request process. So this is another workflow that's been developed out as a part of this pilot project. Beyond depositing the encrypted data, we also want to know that folks can discover those data and request access to them and ultimately have that access granted. So the other side of that encryption process then, of course, is generating well, the way we're using a symmetric encryption key, but what we're doing is linking the key, wrapping it in a second layer of encryption that's linked to a public-private key pairing set. So it's user-specific. They're all time-locked. They're only valid for sort of a brief moment in time. And so we're testing that process as well to verify that folks can download the encrypted package, use the decryption key to decrypt it, and that all of those aspects of the full end-to-end workflow work neatly. So I'll show you this diagram again at a very simple level. This is the zero-knowledge encryption model, but here it is in the context of the actual workflows, working with the FRDR deposit process and then the request process. So we don't need to analyze this in too much detail, but the numbers sort of help you along. So you see that the original data set is encrypted, deposited within FRDR, and then you can request access. So a requester can request access. That request goes to the depositor who must adjudicate it. They have to grant access both to the decryption key and to the encrypted package itself. So we don't allow you to download the encrypted package, unless you've also been given access to the key. And so once the depositor or the requester, sorry, has both of those things, they're able to use the key to decrypt the data set. Using the FRDR encryption application. So the application serves both to encrypt and decrypt the data set. So that was the first aspect of the project, thinking a little bit about technology. As I mentioned, it's not the only technology that we're looking at in the context of CAM, but it's a pilot that we're running in-house at the Alliance. We're also supporting work to look at technologies and services, so CAM-related services that are being operated by partners to the CAM initiative, and also just external groups within Canada to really get a better understanding of the landscape, develop out recommendations around scalability of solutions, gaps that exist currently in Canadian service offerings and so on. As I mentioned, that second component, though, is workflows. So even if you've got great technology, can you use it? Do you have the right permissions in place from your institution? So examples of some of those workflows, the key ones, I think, are things like research ethics review, privacy impact assessments, relevant research contracts that may exist. Those can be grant agreements that often do have language around, either requirements to remit data or requirements that might prevent you from sharing data, contracts with industry partners, and more. There's also a lot of intellectual property considerations. So we have complex and interesting IP frameworks in Canada that relate to research data and research outputs in general. And then how those can interact sometimes with commercialization of research outputs can be really interesting. Research security policies, of course. So we can talk a little bit about that more later. Local infrastructure that may be in place that may create limitations or opportunities with regard to what you can do with data locally. IT requirements that may exist within the institution or a particular department or lab, and then sort of more broadly in general, institutional strategies, data governance that may exist, or other institutional sort of policies and considerations that relate to what researchers do with their data, what they're allowed to do, and how they do it. And then that third component, resourcing. So it's not just researchers, it's also support staff, folks who work within services and elsewhere, all of those offices I just named, like REBs and privacy offices and so on, that need awareness and training, not just on the rules, but how to navigate them, how to make decisions within them, to know what's available to support them as they use technologies or services or navigate processes that impact data management decisions. So these sorts of relevant resources can include training materials, guidance documents, classification tools, risk assessment tools, or frameworks, and so on. So we're casting a pretty broad net with what we're considering a resource. There are 29 partner organizations in the CAM initiative. They're listed here. You may see an institution that you're affiliated with on the list. We're really excited about the level of participation that we've got from these folks. There's a broad variety of ways that we're engaging with them, and we're thrilled with the response that we got nationally when we put out this call for participation and got all of these organizations who were interested and wanted to sign up. So we initially thought this would be a smaller initiative with far fewer organizations participating, and we're thrilled to have representation really from across the country and from a broad variety of different types of organizations. So we've got universities and colleges. We've got 8 of the U15 participating. We have a number of research hospitals that are involved, as well as some other organizations that I wasn't expecting, sort of not-for-profits that do research, some labs that are really cool and do really interesting work. And lots of folks dealing with different types of sensitive data. So it's really great to see that we're not going to pigeonhole ourselves into any particular type of sensitive data, but we're looking quite broadly at lots of different data types and use cases. So in terms of the organization participants that we have, there's lots of folks within these organizations participating in different ways. We've really left it up to them how they want to participate, whether that's with just 1 or 2 people or with a whole cohort of folks from their institution participating. And this list is not fully exhaustive, but at a high level, a lot of the folks that we have involved come from RDM, so a lot of RDM librarians, folks who work with repositories. So, staff that support repositories or otherwise working with their institutional repository in different ways. Folks coming from research ethics and REBs, very important to have them involved. Folks coming from research security and cybersecurity, as well as research services and admin. So that can be everything from grant review to local services within the institution, providing digital tools or other support and different platforms that enable research and support researchers navigating different systems. Folks coming from their privacy offices, a lot of privacy officers and folks who work closely with their privacy office, lots of folks from IT, people coming from research policy and strategy. So folks from the VPR portfolio that are often looking at research strategy at a higher level, or who have a more complex portfolio in terms of different aspects of research within the institution that they're responsible for or that they support. People coming from compliance and legal departments. So people who wear the no hat and are often finding themselves in a position of having to say no, unfortunately, sort of the nature of the beast. But folks coming from different areas of compliance and risk management, and legal counsel within institutions as well. And of course, folks coming from the advanced research computing or high performance computing environment. So those could be local sort of supports on campus or service providers. There are 2 major deliverables that we have for this phase of the CAM initiative. The first is the FRDR pilot test that I mentioned earlier. So we're currently involved in that testing, working with real researchers with real research data sets, and analyzing the results of that pilot test is going to be a key outcome of the initiative. So we're documenting all kinds of things and working closely with the participating researchers and participating institutions to support that pilot test as much as we can and make sure that we've got really robust results to analyze once it's done. The second component then really is a roadmap of recommendations. And I think this is probably much bigger in a sense than the pilot test. There's a lot of valuable things happening within the pilot test that are going to be really fruitful for us to dive into, but the roadmap is much broader than that. And what we're looking at here is working with all 29 partner organizations to develop out recommendations on how we can advance controlled access management for research data in Canada. So to that aim, we have 3 key working groups that we've created under the CAM initiative with participants from the 29 partner organizations. So those working groups are a current state working group, a repository technology and services working group, and data stewardship. So I'll say a little bit about how we've gone about developing out those working groups. So something that we've really tried to embed in the initiative from the start and from the ground up is collaboration. So even in outlining what sort of work we wanted to undertake, what the areas of focus of the working groups would be, So even, before we get to deliverables and specifics, just what we wanted to undertake as a forum for collaboration, all of that was developed collaboratively from the ground up with the partner organizations. So we wanted to make sure that all of those 29 organizations that we listed have the opportunity to see their strategic goals, the needs that they've identified, their institutional priorities, their local drivers, challenges, and opportunities reflected in the working groups, the areas of focus and the deliverables. What we were not looking to do was sort of create a prescribed program and say, this is what we're going to do, either, come do it with us or don't. But rather, there's so much opportunity to collaborate in this environment, so many problems that need to be solved. Which matter most to you? Where would you like to spend your time and your focus and your resourcing, really? So we're quite pleased that the 3 working groups that we have really reflect the interests, the priorities, the strategic goals of the partner organizations. So we're trying to embed that sort of these layers of collaboration and input throughout not just the outputs of the project, but how we've built the initiative itself. So to say a little bit about the individual working groups, so the current state working group really has 2 aims. We're looking to document the current state. That's a pretty bold aim. So we're to limit ourselves. What we're looking at is sort of relevant technologies, initiatives, programs, services, resources, tools, other materials, best practices, and recommendations through a bit of a document search. So we've invited submissions and contributions from folks across the country to submit content to us. And again, casting a wide net. So anything we sort of said, if you're not sure if it's relevant or not, or if it's in scope, err on the side of submission, and we'll sort it out after the fact. What we're looking to do here is build an inventory. So this will ultimately be published and public facing, inventorying sort of content documents, of various types relevant to controlled access management. So the last thing we want to do is reinvent the wheel or duplicate solutions where they already exist. So this is a key element of our work, is to make sure we have a good understanding. It's impossible to have a perfect and complete understanding, but as good an understanding as we can develop of the current state of controlled access management for research data in Canada. So that work's been underway for a number of months. That solicitation of resources was public for some time. It's really helped us to populate this inventory. It's not too late to submit resources if you've got some you'd like to share. And we're working then to analyze the contents of that. So partly what we're doing here is building out that library, categorizing and structuring that inventory of content, but then also prioritizing what content within that we want to analyze. And then from there, developing out recommendations. So really, this is going to be driven by what we learn from what we've received. So it's hard to predict exactly what those recommendations are going to focus on, but we know that training and education is critical, and certainly making sure that solutions that exist are sort of made more apparent within the ecosystem, that it's easier for researchers to discover existing tools and services that meet their needs, are of course emerging as critical. So that's the current state working group. Next is the technologies and services working group. So again, 2 aims. What we're doing here is engaging directly with technologies and service providers, specifically, of course, controlled access management technologies and services. And what we're looking to do here is benefit from the findings of the current state working group in terms of what exists in the ecosystem, prioritize groups that we want to engage with directly, inviting them to come and deliver a session to the working group. And what we want to make sure we're doing is not just getting a lot of sort of 101 intro to technology or service X, Y, or Z presentations. So the members of those working groups are working to hone in on specific findings they'd like to pull from these sessions. Perhaps there's a challenge that a particular technology or service provider has overcome or are still struggling with. Maybe there's an opportunity for something to be scaled as a solution or transferred, something that works really well in one disciplinary context that may work really well in another. So as we're prioritizing the technologies and services in Canada that we want to engage with, developing out goals for that engagement so that we're really maximizing our opportunity to work with those folks and benefit from what we're able to learn from them. Many of those technologies and services are internal in the sense that they're operated by partner organizations that are participating, but many are also external. So folks that that are not sort of currently engaged in the CAM initiative in any way, that we're reaching out to say, we would love to learn more about what you do, and here are some of the goals that we have for engaging with you. And then again, based on those findings, developing out recommendations. So in some cases, that may take the form of, this is a phenomenal solution that needs to be scaled, and here's what will be involved in that, whether that's resourcing or other support. In some cases, it's gap analysis, so recognizing that there are services that meet certain needs, but then there are gaps where needs are not being met, and what we think will be helpful in closing those gaps. Maturity development, so services that exist that maybe are pretty functional and generally meeting needs, but certainly could do with some support maturing, or rounding out, aspects of service offerings that could be developed further, and so on. And recommendations can be sort of at quite a high level, or very granular. One of the things I've tried to emphasize throughout is that we don't necessarily need answers to every question, but recognizing that it's a question worth posing, and identifying key considerations to developing an answer to the question is also a really worthwhile and important aspect of this sort of work. So sometimes you hear folks say, don't come to me with a problem unless you have a solution, and I'm saying that's not the case here. There are many problems where the solution, we might not know the solution if it exists, or it isn't really clear what the solution is, based on current state today, and we still want to know what those questions are and what barriers exist to being able to answer those questions confidently. And that's perhaps going to be more relevant in this last working group, the stewardship working group. So here, what we're looking to do, again, to aim, so identify key data stewardship and governance considerations related to controlled access management. So sort of zooming out a little bit from particular technologies and services, asking at a broader level, what sort of data governance future state are we trying to aim at with regard to research data, and particularly controlled access research data? Something that I think is really key here are roles and responsibilities. So much rests on the researcher's shoulders. They are often responsible for understanding, making decisions, and achieving compliance with a very complex regulatory environment where they're responding to requirements either coming from research security and cybersecurity, but simultaneously from research ethics and maybe from privacy, and from other drivers as well. And it really falls to the researcher to navigate that and to do it correctly. And that's the situation. But certainly, I think everyone would agree that we want to provide researchers with more support navigating those systems, and maybe also, where it's possible to do so, innovate and improve some of those systems so that it's easier to achieve compliance, and it's easier to see a pathway to navigating those systems for the researcher and the folks supporting the researcher. So we can think here, for example, one that comes up a lot are intersections between repository workflows and research ethics. So right now, in terms of how research ethics works and how repositories work, the two typically don't interact much. It's sort of on the researcher to know whether or not their ethics approval enables them to deposit sensitive research data. And it really falls to the repository to just ask questions of the researcher and make a decision about whether or not they can ingest the data. There aren't really clear mechanisms for repositories and REBs to talk directly to each other. Should that be the case? Do institutions want that to be the case? Do we want clearer mechanisms wherein it's more apparent whether or not an REB approval allows for data deposit, and for those mechanisms to be surfaced to repositories directly? So we can think about LIMS, or different systems that universities use to organize data around research administration. And we can probably think, yeah, of course, there's got to be ways for those systems to speak to each other, for it to be made clearer whether or not data can be deposited by an REB, whether or not that's a component of the ethics approval, and for that information to be shared directly with the repository, as opposed to the researcher having to be an intermediary for it, responsible for interpreting their approval, attesting correctly to what that approval entails, and so on and so forth. We might also imagine that institutions would like that layer of control and authority over that process. So rather than having the researcher sort of be the sole finger on the trigger, for there to be a role for the institution, approving a deposit or indicating that a deposit has been approved by the relevant decision makers within the institution. And that's just one sort of nitpicky example. There are many. So how these systems interact with each other, what that sort of opportunities that those interactions can create to make life easier for the researcher, but then challenges that exist, technically speaking, to get systems to speak to each other, maybe even vulnerabilities that could be introduced as a result of trying to innovate some of those workflows. This group is taking up all of that, but looking at it really from a data stewardship and governance perspective. So some of the technical stuff, we're going to roll over to the technology and services working group. This working group is sort of focused on those larger overarching questions about a future state or a broader data governance vision for how research data can be supported in Canada. And then how we can get closer to that future state. So developing out recommendations based on the analysis of the above on enacting data stewardship and governance that's more deliberate and enables us to manifest the future state that we're aiming toward. We can also think here sort of broadly about some of the limitations of the current state for data governance of research data. So for example, I mentioned intellectual property offices earlier. I think the typical sort of models for IP ownership within institutions are either the researcher is the sole owner of their IP, or it's jointly owned between the researcher and the institution. But what people often sort of don't realize is that ownership is just a part of sort of the assets you own as a person. So especially in a sole ownership model, those data don't revert to your institution or some sort of disciplinary society when the researcher unfortunately passes. That's a part of their estate. Suddenly their spouse or their surviving kids or whoever their next of kin are responsible for or have ownership over that data set. It's a bit shocking, I think, for most folks. You wouldn't anticipate that would be the reality. And even in a joint ownership model, that's jointly owned then by the next of kin of the researcher. And I would suggest it's quite unusual for a researcher to make provisions for how their research data should be managed in their last will and testament or other sort of probate documentation. Not unheard of, but certainly not a common and standard practice. So thinking beyond sort of everything resting on the researcher's shoulders and the life cycle of the data sort of lying with the researcher, how can we create data governance and stewardship frameworks that at a higher level deburden the researcher of much of that responsibility, if not ownership and sort of moral rights to those responsibilities, but a lot of the day-to-day finicky aspects of it. And that also enable us to smartly support stewardship of data in the long term, certainly beyond the life cycle of an individual researcher, let alone an individual research data project. And again, of course, recommendations based on the analysis of all of the above. So just to turn now to cybersecurity more specifically in the context of this initiative. As you've heard, there's a variety of areas of practice, folks coming from different professional backgrounds and expertise that are contributing to this collaborative initiative. But certainly there's a strong role for cybersecurity folks within the initiative, people coming from cybersecurity, research security, and IT, sort of at a higher level as well. Some of the things that I'm quite interested in and that we've heard about from participants include data classification and risk assessment, access control and identity management, of course, encryption and data security, but governance and policy compliance with research security policies and systems of data governance. Training and awareness, not just for users, but service providers, continuous improvement. So recognizing that when we do an assessment of a particular system or infrastructure, that doesn't remain static forever, that changes on, to a third party that has its own vendor and it's changed vendors or changes to, particular aspects of hardware. All of these things can impact risk classification or, risk assessment related to different systems or technologies. So understanding that, continuous improvement, but also sort of continually changing risk profiles and how to create systems that are sensitive to and responsive to that reality. Emerging trends, risks, and best practices in cybersecurity that relate to research data management. So something that I'm quite interested in is sort of demystifying aspects of cybersecurity and recognizing that cybersecurity isn't only technical or isn't a strictly technical thing, just in the sense that it's broader than that. So it's not only about the specifics of the hardware or the software that you're using, but how you're using it, the systems you have in place around it. So, a risk classification, framework or data classification matrix, these things themselves are not technologies, but they're determining, or they're intended at least to determine how we use different technologies so that we're doing it in a way that's compliant with cybersecurity best practices or policies. So questions I have for the group: how can professionals in RDM, in research ethics, privacy, policy, services, and more collaborate more effectively with cybersecurity and research security professionals? So if you wear that cybersecurity or research security professional hat, what do you want to see from your colleagues who maybe are reaching out to you, maybe you're engaged in certain institutional collaborations already? What makes those collaborations effective and fruitful? What do you want to see from your colleagues, or how can we support those colleagues in collaborating more effectively with you? Or if you're one of the aforementioned group and you work with, you collaborate already with cybersecurity and research security folks, how do you do that? What makes it effective? What are lessons that you've learned there? And then really just this idea that cybersecurity does encompass more than technology. So it includes policies, practices, guidance, and more. How can we bring more folks into conversations around cybersecurity that don't focus only on technical aspects or sort of hardware and software aspects of systems and technologies, but broaden that out so we're able to think a little bit more creatively and maybe demystify a little bit how to engage with policies, practices, and guidance that relate to cybersecurity, but that require input and expertise from other folks as well, and that certainly are intended to be understood and implemented by end users who may not be professionals in any of these fields in particular. So just some discussion questions for the group. That's my name and contact information again, but I'll just go back to those questions there. So you've got them on the screen. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Victoria. That was awesome. I just put an invitation in the chat for participants to share their thoughts. If you have any specific ideas or questions that you'd like to share, again, the Q&A feature is there and available for you. If you'd also like to come into the panelist room and share your thoughts out loud, just raise your hand and I'll pull you in. So, Victoria, I'm seeing from the chat from Alex Brasimov. So 2 questions. What kind of in-place processing can be done with encrypted data in the repository without having to download it? And do you currently support zero-knowledge encryption workflows on the Alliance HPC clusters, or any plans to do so in the future?
So for the first question with regard to FRDR and the pilot we're operating, none. So the way it works is you have to download the encrypted package locally and then decrypt it locally. So obviously this is not a solution for data that are well suited to sort of data visitation, secure data enclave, sort of being able to query data in situ to get responses back. So it's a bit of a very specific use case in terms of when this particular solution is appropriate. Some examples for me that really come to mind are highly qualitative data. So audio and video recordings of interviews, cultural heritage data, focus groups, data essentially where you wouldn't be applying an inclusion-exclusion criteria to extract a subset of the data, or data that aren't big data in the sense of it not being feasible to move them or to download them or to have a local copy. So it's limited in that sense, but there is some versatility to the encryption platform itself. So it's pretty adaptable, and I think there's ways it can work with other environments that do allow for sort of data visitation or other models of just being able to process sort of data within the repository directly. But that's not the way FRDR functions. And so in terms of what we're testing with this pilot right now, it's sort of the traditional FRDR workflow that involves a local downloaded copy of the data. So there's, of course, some limitations with that, or many limitations with that. But there's also, I think, use cases where it's really the solution you would be looking for. We're not trying to meet all of the needs or solve all of the problems, but test out a solution that we think is really appropriate to some use cases, or the best solution for some use cases, an effective solution in others, and then explore the versatility of the application more broadly, where it can be used in other environments that have other functionalities. And in terms of the second question, so do we support the encryption workflows in Alliance HPC clusters? So FRDR itself is hosted on Alliance HPC clusters. So that's where we're storing currently all of the open data that we steward, that we publish, and where we will be storing the encrypted packages deposited with FRDR in this pilot and in a future service offering. But the way that the encryption application works is it's downloaded locally. So certainly if somebody has their data stored on an Alliance HPC cluster and that's where they want to download the application and use it, they can do that, no problem, or just access it if it's already downloaded. Absolutely, but it's not limited to that. So certainly it's a pretty lightweight application designed to be pretty platform agnostic. So it really can be used in any environment. It's not like it's, to be clear, like it's not something you log into with a browser, through a web browser or anything like that. Like it's just a standalone piece of software that you install wherever you have your data. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Victoria. And we have another question in the Q&A. So this is an anonymous question. So great presentation. With zero-knowledge encryption, is there a concern about data retention and long-term maintenance? So considering the possibility of lost keys, example, people lose data all the time, and has key recovery been addressed, such as key escrow, etc.?
So really great question, and something I've had a lot of back and forth with the development team on. So yeah, the way, of course, that the development team initially wanted to approach this was to make it as secure as possible, which means the researcher is given sort of a key. They have to write it down. If they lose it, it's lost forever. There's no way to recover it, and no one but the researcher would have access to it. And I said, okay, so it's day one. 90% of users have lost their key. What happens next? I think we need to be prepared for a reality where, users are going to lose their keys. So I think this is an interesting area where, from my perspective, coming from a research ethics background, I'm very happy with risk. I will tolerate risk. Working with folks who come more from the development security side of the house, they're looking to eliminate it, absolutely, and sort of create systems that don't tolerate risk to the greatest extent possible. And I think there's a balance here. So certainly we want secure systems, but I think there need to be mechanisms for the institution and the researcher to recover keys. And that introduces certain vulnerabilities, but the system needs to be functional. And if we have a system that can't be used because folks lose their keys and then that's it, that's not a functional system. It's not going to, address the need that we're looking to address. So I think we haven't built that out yet, not fully. But what I'm keen on is working with institutions beforehand to identify how they want to address that. And that's something I didn't mention in the presentation, but it's pretty key to what we're doing. Often solutions, technologies, and services are developed and then made available to Canadian researchers, and then there's no uptake, in part because a keen researcher goes to their institution and says, I want to use this, and the institution says no, because there's some aspect of the terms of use that don't align, or there's just like a really conservative person reviewing this in an office, who doesn't quite understand what it is, but sees a few red flags and says, absolutely not. So what we're looking to do here with the FRDR service is begin from a collaboration with institutions, so that as we build out from a functionality perspective and from a terms of use perspective, a system that will meet the needs of institutions, that they can allow their researchers to use confidently. So essentially, it's trying to transform potential users into co-authors or co-developers. So if they're co-developing the technology with us, co-authoring the policy framework that accompanies it, we're sort of embedding their needs directly into what we're building, so that we can be sure Canadian researchers from various institutions across the country, as many as we can get to contribute, will be able to use the technology. There was also part of that question, I think, about sort of data retention and long-term maintenance. This is something we're really interested in developing out more on. I would say it's not something, it's a problem we've solved. So part of the value proposition of FRDR is that we perform checksums, that we're preventing, that we're monitoring data and maintaining it to ensure that we're not going to lose data to, to bit rot, to degradation over time. This is more challenging when working with encrypted data. It also presents challenges for traditional archival practices. So not a problem that we've solved. Essentially, it's right now with what we've built. We can meet our obligations or our goals for medium-term storage of the data. Long-term storage, I think, is something that we still need to work on. But because your question links these things, I think, for a good reason, because I think key recovery and capacity to engage with that data set in one form or another over time is ultimately what's going to enable us to develop and implement best practices around long-term maintenance of the data as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Victoria. I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I will just take over screen sharing. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your interest and your continued enthusiasm for securing our digital environment. It is everyone's responsibility. So we would love to hear more from you. If you have questions for Victoria, please feel free to reach out, and we would love to continue the conversation. So here's a heads up to some of the upcoming sessions. So we will be right back here tomorrow, actually, for a presentation on insider threats, presented by Benjamin Reed and myself. And then we'll see you next week for a session on zero trust in HPC. So this is presented by Tayson Macaulay and Didaksha Babaskar from the National Center for Critical Infrastructure Protection. So that will be on Thursday, October 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So as always, the registration information is on the Alliance's website. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks again, Victoria.